Hello, everyone. I'm going to give a quick lecture on intermediate and advanced MO strategy, conceptualizing the MO as a speech more than just responses to the MG. Uh, I'm a mod. I MO'd pretty exclusively for 4 years at the University of Chicago. And today I'm going to talk about what I think is one of the most underrated and skill testing speeches in the format. So, first, what this lecture is and is not. Because parts of this lecture I think are going to be incredibly useful, but it isn't a catch-all, and certainly it is not for anyone who is just picking up the MO today. First, we are going to be refining MO strategy or conceptualizing of the tools that the MO has to use, when they should use them, how can they be most effective. But the assumption for this is that you already are an MO who has some experience under your belt. So you're okay at the line by line, you can respond to PMC and MG, you know how to read overviews, you know how to do weighing, you understand what a turn is. This lecture is more about when and how to use these tools versus how to use them in the first place. Next, on sounding like an MO, we're going to be talking about how MOs can make the most of the words and rhetoric in their speech and how to force judges to listen and how to force PMRs to ignore. Because there are a lot of MOs that may be quite good, but unfortunately run into the issue of judging where judges are unwilling to credit MOs, or the issue of PMRs being unwilling to credit MOs with some of the strongest pieces of their argumentation. And lastly, we're going to be talking about flowing and thinking, because beyond being able to create or craft very good MOs, you need to be prepared to create them and to give them, which often requires flowing very intentionally and in a different way than if you were giving, say, the MG, LOR, or PMR after it. A couple of notes here, though, is one, this is very stylistic. I'm going to give thoughts about MOs a lot in the way that I gave them and how other MOs that I respect and debated a lot when I was on the league gave them. The meta may advance. You may find things that work better for you. Obviously, this lecture is not going to be comprehensive in that regard, but it will serve to at least give some insight on kind of the highest level MOs of today. Next, MOs are a very stylistic speech similar to the PMR. So how you develop your own personal style uh, is beyond the scope of this lecture. You may develop it from hearing other people talk, from just the way you like to give speeches, from something else entirely. And then lastly, you're likely going to get worse or notice yourself getting worse directly after listening to or implementing things in this lecture. The reason why I say this is because moving from an MO that's largely line by line to one that makes more active strategic decisions is often one that requires more risk and leads to more of those decisions being incorrect, right? If you're currently giving MOs that don't win or lose the round and kind of tread water for the LOR to finish, then giving this style of MO will open yourself up to more strategic missteps and open yourself up to things like, for example, PMR pull-throughs or turns. But I think that if you are able to master this form of MO and execute on a high level, the end result is a higher ceiling for MOs than the one you are able to have currently. Cool. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about the block and I guess APDA as a game, because this gives you the prior for how you are supposed to think about MO in the upcoming slides. And even if you kind of forget or don't take to heart things that I say after this, if you can really understand the advantage of the MO, from there you can build on MO strategy in a way that avoids some of the pitfalls of very common MOs I see on the league and helps emphasize some of the best parts of the speech. So first, the block is broken. If we look at all the speeches in the round, the block or the MO-LOR combo is by some margin the longest speech or longest amount of uninterrupted speech time in the round. It is actually by far the most dominant intrinsic feature of APTA as a game, which is why we see, for example, in motions tournaments, OP having on net very high win rates, high 50s, low 60s. Now, the reason why we see a lot of PMR and Gov wins in cases is because of the strength of PMC, and pre-written cases go very far with a PMR that can use PMC. But if you're able to utilize the block, you can make PMR very difficult in a way that you can eliminate that advantage of bringing the case. And your goal with the block is to do that. Because if the block serves as diverse offensive material that the PMR has to engage with, and defensive material that the PMR has to wade through to get to its own material, then what you effectively done is created a 13-5 time skew that makes it very hard for the PMR to win, save for them being very strategic and efficient with their time. Notably, this forces them to execute at a level equal or higher than the block, whereas if your block is inefficient or doesn't really look to use these strategies, the PMR can just do what it was always going to do. It doesn't really require the PM to be very good at giving a PMR. It can just repeat PMC. And so this lecture is going to talk about how we force those errors more often. Really quickly here, the Platonic LOR MO conjunction is an MO that reads what is essentially LOR version 1, right? It beats MG and PMC. It responds to everything and makes it sound like everything was already responded to. It pushes the op line forward, and it allows the LOR to read a completely new and separately winning version of the LOR that comes to a cohesive op line that is spread across all 13 minutes. What does this mean you shouldn't do? And this is the first part of the lecture, things you should avoid when doing MOs. First, menial line by line. PMRs are very good at picking what rebuttal matters and what doesn't. And if it does matter, they will respond to it. An MO that responds to every claim in the MG should lose to a PMR that is giving a 31 or a 32. And because PMR gets explicit responses, it can beat what it wants to beat and ignore the rest. So you're losing a lot of that time by responding to things that the PMR is going to give up and not go for anyways. Next is repetition. If your speech and the LOR speech sound the same, then you functionally wasted half of your time, possibly more. And if there is not anything new in MO that is separate from LOR, judges are discouraged from listening to MO, PMRs are discouraged from listening to MO, and anything that you thought you did that was unique or very important is drowned out by all of the things that just sound like LOR again. Lastly is leaving gaps in analysis. So while the kind of MO that we're going to be talking about in this lecture is going to back away from the technical line by line that I just critiqued, that doesn't mean that you can ignore important PM lines and MG lines that become balanced. And so it does mean figuring out a way to still engage with these parts of the gov while doing all the strategic steps you want to do in MO, such that you are both able to close yourself off from easy PMR ballots and still get some of the strategic flourishes that we think are very important. Cool. So the first part of this then is forcing the judge to flow. This is arguably the most important part of the lecture in that if we assume that you're relatively able to give some new offense and respond to the MG and PMC, the most important thing then is making sure the judge is flowing and considering those things when deciding who they want to vote for. So I have 4 broad mechanisms here that you should be implementing in your MO speeches to make the most out of what the judge is willing to flow. So first we're going to talk about performativity. And the maybe honest, ugly truth is that the easiest way for people to listen to your MOs is for you to become reppy and force them to listen to it by way of your rep. But given that not everyone who listens to this lecture is going to be reppy, you need to be very performative in the way that you say and do things to signal to the judge that it is something that they need to be flowing or considering. Because if you just begin talking about something, the judge may flow it and ignore it when it comes to time to make the RFD. If you say, this is an overview that beats the gov, they are both forced to flow it in a different way independently and also forced to at least look at it and consider it when thinking of who they want to vote for. So you should be constantly talking about what you are doing and how that interacts with the PMR and the gov, almost to the point where you are giving a meta-analysis on the importance of your speech. You see this similarly in BP, if any of you do that format regularly, when it comes to selling your extension, you really do need to sell the stuff you want to go for an MO for the judge to listen to it. And this looks like saying things like, and this argument means that X, or this engages with Gov's argument on Y, or this means PMR gets no new responses here. It could even look like saying, here is a new piece of offensive material that is more important than anything else we have established in the round. Here are 3 reasons why it's true. If we win this argument, we beat the Gov in these ways, right? Signposting to the judge the importance of your arguments and even flagging them as explicitly things that PMR needs to respond to help you more than they hurt you, because it may mean that PMR will engage, but that engagement is always less important than making sure the judge is willing to adjudicate and vote on it. Next is on LOR help. Look, sometimes the judge just doesn't care. So the way to make them care is for the judge to feel as though the MO is cohesive with LOR and LOR is cognizant of MO. So what this looks like is your LOR saying, there's a lot of great material in MO you should look at. Here's how we weigh it against the PMR, and spending 15, 20 seconds on it. Important thing is for the LOR not to spend too much time on it so that you don't run into the issue of repetitiveness, but just enough so that the judge can look to the MO flow and see the rest of the argumentation there. It also looks like cohesion, because if it sounds like the MO and the LOR are 2 different, mutually exclusive worlds of speeches, sometimes the judge will discredit the MO and just look to the LOR. So while your speeches should be different, they should still be cohesive under a broad op frame. This means that MO probably shouldn't be knifing the LOR explicitly in the weighing or the arguments. One caveat is that if you think you are that far behind after MG that the LOC is unsalvageable, maybe then you go for 5 new arguments in MO, change the course of the round entirely, and the LOR follows your lead. That's a case-by-case basis situation that is not very common, but is something that can happen. So this also leads me to sounding new with new examples, mechanisms, and weighing. Even if you are reading arguments that originated in LOC, it's important to be always expanding the scope of those arguments, both so that it sounds like you did something new and unique, and so that you can hide new implications in your expansion that PMR can't respond to because the initial claim is from LOC. So this looks like new examples, new mechanisms, and new weighing. And when we look at flowing, I'll explain this in more detail, but there are many instances in which an initial LO claim can be another 2 or 3 minutes of MO material that still are cohesive under the LOC frame and can be cross-applied to big splotches of Gov material that are still from the LOC frame. And it makes it very tricky for the PMR to really do anything, because you can just bombard them with new calls and say, this was an LOC, the MG just extends, the MO just extends on it or gives a new example of it or gives a new mechanism. Depending on how new you sound, some judges will give PMR some credence, but most judges will severely curtail the extent to which PMR gets new responses to MO, because even if they give you new responses to MO, most judges will then be willing to credit the LOC claim as not being able to be responded to. And that's really all you need, is for the judge to accept and believe that a part of this argument is conceded from LOC and then weighed in LOR. The last thing we want to talk about here is structure. So there are 2 broad ideological lenses of the MO. The first is clash by class. The second is offensive overviews. I'll talk about offensive overviews because it's a little bit easier to transition to from just a strict line-by-line MO. This is where a set of overviews at the top of your MO controls what your MO does in the round, right? So you'll say, here are 3 overviews to begin. And those overviews might take 5.5 minutes, because even though they are overviews in name, there are big splotches of argumentation, responsiveness, weighing, framing, etc., that are packaged into these overviews. And you want the judge to be flowing these overviews as almost complete ballots or recontextualizations of the round. And so these can be offensive. Here is a brand new argument with Mex and Wayne. These can be conceded arguments out of MG that then become way more important in MO, i.e., here is the argument they dropped. Here are 3 reasons why it implicates their entire case. Here are 3 additional reasons why it's true, nuancing away from any PMR responses. Or these can even be defensive, right? They misunderstand our framing. Here is an additional 2 reasons why the narrative or the policy or the social group is affected in this way, and this means XYZ implication. So they don't have to always be offensive explicitly, but they should meaningfully change the way in which you engage with the round, right? For you to justify spending as much time as you are on these overviews, you should both tell the judge and know what the overview does to transform the round. After that, you can go back to the on-case and off-case flows and do any extraneous responses that don't fit into the above overview. But usually, most of the responses should be kind of lumped into the overview or framed or weighed over by the overview, such that you make the conscious decision to spend less time on the flow here, just cleaning up any specific stragglers you don't want the PMR to have access to. The other kind of thought here is to go clash by clash. And in some instances, this is similar, but it's a little bit different. This is where you take the debate and you say, okay, there are functionally 4 or 3, whatever questions. First is the principal debate. Second is the Prague. Under the Prague, there are 2 questions. First, how the policy is implemented. Second, backlash or politics or whatever, right? Just as an example. In the clash, you explain what the clash is comprised of. So maybe their argument 1 and our argument 1 and 2 are all a part of the same clash. Explain why you are winning it. So this is where you explain why your arguments are more probable, more nuanced, more likely, more proximate, any of the words you use to describe or weigh your link level claims over theirs. And in these class by class structures, you want to be very performative and rhetorical because you're supposed to explain why the conception of the world that exists in each individual clash is preferable on your side than theirs. So you need to walk the judge through very slowly, almost like you're giving a PMR, why your clash is better or ahead. And do that for I would say, no more than 4, but likely 3 big clashes in the round. The advantage of this is that if you can predict the clashes that the PMR wants to go for, you meet them directly on their field, right? You are explicitly trying to outframe and beat them on the clashes that they care about. And if they hear the PMR and think that it's ultimately less persuasive than the MO, the round just ends, like you lose. Like they give the ballot and you say, and the judge says, I heard this ballot in MO, and I don't think you beat it. I don't think your ballot is more likely or made better than the MO ballot. I vote off, right? The downside of this, though, is that you often sacrifice a lot of the technical line-by-line debate. You won't have enough time to hit every single new response from MG or PMC because you are doing a lot of the crystallization and grouping that is required for a clash-by-clash speech. And this can sometimes mean that the PMR gets up and goes, here are 2 conceded MG warrants, 1 conceded PM warrant, here's 4 minutes of weighing, haha, we win. And that does happen sometimes, but if you develop a very framing and weighing heavy clash by clash structure, those incidental concessions are hard to push through the kind of sea of weighing that you've established in MO. So you do open yourself up to those warrant extensions, but the trade-off is that you are better on the weighing front. And these both clash by clash and overview-based MOs have advantages and disadvantages. I think the platonic MO can fluctuate based on the round and the situation and the team. But if you're not there yet, just look to the MO that you're more comfortable with and that focuses on your core skills, right? If you think you're very good at the strategic game, look to the clash by clash and just try and strategically outpace your opponents. If you think you're better at just kind of being mech dense, impact dense, explaining things, and then you can still look to where you have made mistakes on the flow, then you would want to look at the offensive overviews instead. Cool. Next, then we are going to talk about flowing and thinking, because this is just as important, and it also kind of controls what you're even able to do in MO based on how you see the round. So 4 broad things to live by. 1, find gaps in the gov responsiveness. 2, push the limits of existing LSC material. 3, close off any possible PMR lines. And 4, consider all pieces of offense in the clash. So we're going to look at this kind of sample round that I have here. This is by no means comprehensive, but also I want to note that it's hard to explain or look at MOs without a full round of context. So the best way of practicing and flowing is just by doing those practice rounds, hearing the LOR and PMR, seeing what you missed, seeing what the big parts of the debate were, seeing what more you could have done, and then from there giving redos with what you missed in mind, which may also influence your flowing, because you can say, I missed this because on my flow, I did not have that argument. I did not have those responses, or I wasn't able to identify that this was an undercovered piece of material. But for what we do have, in this round, PMC gives 2 broad arguments. Under those arguments are 2 claims each with 2 mechs and an impact each. I have just labeled it all here: arg1, claim 1, mech 1, mech 2, impact, so on and so forth. The LOC does most of their time on the off case and gives some responses to PMC. This is the archetypical LOC that spends 6-7 minutes off case and then goes like strolls through PMC, kind of picking and choosing, and then going, ML will handle the rest. They're pretty good at the top half of PMC. Then they get to the bottom half and only give some responses to impacts because they don't have any time left for the mechanistic clash. They also miss a few mechs and miss a few claims at the top as well. MG is dense. It goes down the flow. It responds to most things from the LOC. It adds some weighing from the dropped claim from argument 2. It responds to the last impact. It does miss some things though. And because it misses some things or isn't as explicit on some things, it opens up some avenues for the MO. So a couple of things I want to point to. Mech 2 that you see in argument 1 has no ink on it. It's a PMC argument. LOC misses it. MG misses it. Big blaring red flags should hit your head. It is just sitting there in the round to be weighed and impacted. Argument 2, there is not a lot of direct response to the entire argument, and MG is beginning to weigh a claim under the argument as quite important. So you need to focus some time there. And then lastly, that LOC makes a response to impact 3, MG misses the response. So what can we do with that missed response? And here I outline what a very good MO can look like on the gov case. Some responses here and there, but on mechanism 2, when you see big missed arguments, look to turns for that material. Why is that preferable? Because direct responses both are new in MO and can be beaten by PMR. So if PMR wanted to go for mech 2, and they knew that as soon as LOC missed it, they want to go for mech 2, the only part of their speech, the MO speech they will listen to, is your responses. And they will beat all of those responses and then weigh the ballot and win. So in this case, you want to look to trying to do things like turning the argument so that they have to deal both with the offensive nature of your turn and deal with the defense. In instances like this, PMRs might just instead say, it's too much work, I'll beat the turn and move on, and not extend any offensive material into PMR, which for you is enough, because the benefit of turns is that a failed turn is just defense, right? It isn't something you can lose on unless the PMR wants to put a lot of time into it. And you are fine in most cases just breaking even with turns and allowing the rest of your offensive material in the LOR to win you the round. Next, on the argument 2, I have here framing, because another way you can deal with stuff that your LOC is missing or undercovering is by being very heavy into framing out or framing away from certain arguments. Likely it's the case that this MO recognizes you cannot really beat argument 2, and if the gov wants to go for it, they need a way around it. And that's when you just frame out both A, how often argument 2 takes effect, how bad it might be, how relevant or unique it is given the gov case statement, and why the op arguments may be more important, because they happen first, because they are more proximate to marginalized individuals or individuals you care about in the round, because there's some principle you ought follow, etc. This is very similar in fashion to weighing, and sometimes just becomes weighing, but the advantage of MO is that you can weigh with arguments, weigh with mechanisms. You don't have to only rely on material you already have from LOC. You can add new things as you see fit to help build up that framing. The unique difference between this, though, and just outright argumentation is outright argumentation can be refuted, right? It can be counter-asserted against, it can be beaten in PMR. The advantage of framing and weighing is that it assumes to some extent that the argument is true, such that PMR can't just respond line by line. It instead implicates that in the case the argument is true, how the argument compares to or interacts with either other gov arguments or op arguments, which forces the PMR to do a lot more work to justify why the argument is worth voting on. And that's the unique advantage of MO, is being able to do those justifications. So lastly then, on expanding. In the case that you see an argument that the MG is undercovering or not covering, those should have alarm bells as well, but those alarm bells should be green, because that is a huge piece of offense that is just conceded that should become large parts of the block. And there are two ways to kind of identify this. One is if the MG is light on the question. So one response or one example or one assertion that isn't strong enough to beat the core claim of the LOC. That's when you can get up and say, they have a response, but it is not sufficient. It's too flippant, whatever. We're going to win it anyway. Second is if they just don't respond to it at all. That's a lot easier to notice because it's just a blank spot on your flow. If it's a blank spot on your flow, consider extending it. If there is some response, be very critical about whether or not the response is sufficient. And in the case that it's not, have some personal way to note to yourself that it is insufficient. Maybe this is circling it, using a different colored pen, drawing a big arrow. I don't care, whatever works best for you. Make sure you are able to identify when a response is too flippant given the analysis from LOC. And what do I mean by expanding this argument? Add more mechanisms, add more implication, really push home on the rhetorical front and the technical front that the gov dropping this argument is disastrous, and it implicates how they're able to engage in the rest of the debate, because they made this huge round-ending, paradigm-shifting issue that they just didn't engage in the super important argument. That is what the judge should be thinking about when you're extending it. And you should also be cross-applying the extension and expansion of this argument, right? Because in this case, there was no MG response to impact 3. There was an LOC response to impact 3. The expansion the MO gives should and can be comprehensive enough that you can reliably cross-apply that response and expansion to claim 4, MEC 7, MEC 8, right? You can cross-apply it to a lot of different places on the flow, because now that you have a conceded piece of material and sufficient expansion on that material, you now have a big piece of defense that they can't engage with, or a big piece of offense that they can't engage with, that you should be trying to sprinkle in as many places as possible. Some of these places, unreasonable, some of them very reasonable. It's the PMR's job to pick which is which. Some of these follow logically from the LOC. Some of these are probably new, or they cross the line to newness because you kind of have to stretch to make the extension. Again, PMR's job to pick. And so this forces the PMR to both A, identify what they can respond to, B, try and respond to it in a manner that makes it new, and 3, after the new call, forces the judge to ask themselves whether or not it's new. And at any of those 3 points, if it flows to you, you are winning, right? You are putting a big stopgap on PMR balance you want to go for. And very often in these instances, what happens is you make this extension of a dropped response, you cross-apply it to a bunch of different places, the PMR attempts to beat it by putting a response or 2 on it, they're new called, the RFD comes back 20 minutes later, I vote off, I don't think that MG handles this response efficiently. I don't think that PMR's defense on it is good enough, right? That is how you win these rounds off of dropped material. Cool. So now that we've handled how to make the most of your flow, last thing I'm going to talk about then is just the things the MO can do and kind of how you should think about them when you're trying to do them, right? So the four, I guess, tools in the MO's toolkit is new weighing, turns to PMC and MG, new framing, and rebuttal. All of these things we have talked about interspersed through the above slides and material, but I'm just going to go over them again and talk about how you should be conceptualizing of them in the round as you're an MO. So first is on rebuttal. The important thing to note about MO rebuttal is that it's super fickle because PMR can respond to it. So the rebuttal in MO should be exclusively arguments that the PMR cannot respond to, or arguments that would be time negative for the PMR to respond to, right? And anything that's not those ends up wasting your time. So what does it look like to have an argument that PMR can't respond to? Most explicitly, it is, as we just talked about, a response that MG drops that you can implicate to other parts of the flow. Because if the PMR believes it's from LO, or the judge believes it's from LO, it stops them from even attempting to engage with the material. But second is things that are hard for the PMR to respond to. So doing the one or two blippy responses all the way down the on case that you see in MG is often not sufficient, because if the PMR wants to go for one argument and there's only one or two simple responses on that argument, it's very easy for the PMR to beat those responses and then weigh and make the ballot. You should be, if you are responding in ways that are very nuanced and in-depth, so that if the PMR wants to go for that part of the flow, there's a lot more work that needs to be done there, sometimes too much work to be done, and they move somewhere else. This trades off with being able to cover everything, but instead picks the things that they want to cover purposefully, such that those things no longer are PMR ballots. So it looks like accepting that you will miss 2, 3, 4 individual mechanisms, but that your top shelf response to the argument is both explicitly comparative, nuanced, and weighed so that the PMR has a hard time getting through that type of response. This also means that every piece of rebuttal in your MO should be explicitly comparative, right? Assertion, counter assertion helps the person who speaks last because they are the last assertion. So assertion, counter assertion, example, counter example means the PMR will always win. The way you stop this is by being comparative with Gov claims. Even if what they say is true, we still win because X. Even if their argument is true in some cases, our argument is true in the most cases because Y. Even if their argument is true for some actors, our argument is true for a much more significant group of actors because Z, right? In that explicit comparison, both calls to the judge's head what the Gov has said on any given question, but also means that the PMR has to not just beat your argument, but beat the version of the argument that you've already frontlined in your response. And so sometimes what happens here is that the PMR responds and the judge goes, I heard your response, but it doesn't beat the preemption that the MO already gave, so I don't credit it. Next, I'm going to talk about turns. And turns are essentially any argument the Gov makes. The opposite is true. It's actually an op argument. We know what turns are. When should you deploy turns? The one thing I will be very wary of in MO is making yourself very turnable. And this is true both for new arguments and for turns that you make. And you should think not just how do I flood as much offense as possible, but how do I be very cautious about the way in which I put new offense in my speech? Because one of the things I see for MOs who are trying to make the next step is that they over-index on these tools and they, for example, read 15 turns or 4 or 5 new arguments. And the PMR just picks 1 or 2, explains why they're wrong, implicates them as Gov material, and then beats the op with their own MO. Because the MO, since it is new, gives PMR new responses. So use that to frame the things I talk about with weighing and turns. First on turns, what should you be turning? One, big ticket items that the PMR wants to go for. Things like philosophical obligations and principles, big impacts to large swatches of people, economic disaster, et cetera, depends on the round. But you should have an idea of things that are contestable, that aren't seen as prior goods, in questioning whether or not they are prior goods. For example, in a recent round I debated in, the debate was about whether or not the government should subsidize childcare. And a turn the op can read on the gov case here is that, well, actually, things like after school programs and tutoring is far more important than childcare. That childcare happens when you're very young. It's highly replaceable, right? You can go to your aunts or your grandmas or to the nice lady down the street, et cetera, et cetera. Childcare isn't that important. What's far more important is things like access to food or things like being able to be housed after you finish school, but your parents have not come home from work, which is often like multiple hours before you're old enough to be able to be in the house alone, right? And just contesting whether or not there is some intrinsic and huge magnanimous benefit to going to a daycare or a pre-K. This is something that you need to change your kind of ideology or mind about when you are thinking about APDA, because sometimes people fall into the trap of just assuming prior goods are prior and good, and then not contesting those parts of the debate, especially as it relates to liberal positions, like minority community believes X, right? They want to get rid of their oppression, blah, 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 blah. And you're like, okay, that's just true, move on. Really ask yourself as the MO whether or not this is true. And if there are moderate positions you can take against these commonly held beliefs, things like libertarianism or fiscal conservatism, or acknowledging that minorities are a heterogeneous group of people with different goals, incentives, and conceptions of their marginalized status, right? And that is how you can both identify turns and then really turn the knife in the gov once you've gotten a turn on the table. Next on new weighing. So new weighing usually comes in the form of new arguments. So just like here is a brand new argument, or here is a version of an argument from LOC that's implicated to a different group or a different actor that is sufficiently new. You should both, one, explain the newness of this argument, differentiating from the LOC. Second, explain its cohesion to the LOC. So if you are taking parts from LOC, which parts are you taking? And if those parts are conceded, why those parts didn't prove your argument? And then giving the argument in the weighing alongside it. The important thing to note about this new weighing is, unlike the MG, unlike the LOC, unlike the prior speeches, you know what the tools the gov has are, right? All of their cards are on the table. PMC and MG have happened, nothing new in PMR outside of response to MO. This means that your weighing should not be flat. It should be incredibly intertwined and interwoven with the PMR and with the gov bench. This is because you are able to not just weigh with impacts, but weigh with impact comparisons. Since debate is not a game of proving your side per se, but a game of proving your side more than the other side, your impacts can be, like I said earlier, explicitly comparative with the gov. And this is something I'm going to say a lot, because the MG's biggest advantage is being able to be comparative with the gov while being able to add new material. And so your weighing should aim to engage with the gov and aim to engage with the op case by pushing forward an op line with new actors, new incentives, and new pieces of offense that may better be situated to beat the gov that you didn't think of or didn't think were relevant come LOC or prep. The last thing I'm going to talk about briefly here is framing. This is similar to weighing in some regards, but as I explained in the earlier slide, it relates more to just accepting that parts of the op are true and accepting that if parts of the op or gov are true, how they are situated in the round, right? Framing's biggest role is telling the judge what they need to evaluate first, rather than telling the judge that you've won, right? So using all of these strategies in conjunction, a good MO can tell the judge the order of arguments they should consider when voting, put a new argument or two into that order by way of weighing, take a gov argument or two out of that order by way of rebuttal, and then giving yourself insurance by on some of the remaining gov arguments reading turns that say, even if you think this is important or you want to vote here first, you need to make sure that the gov is beating the turn before you can vote for the gov. And all of those steps make it exceptionally hard for the PMR to win or for the judge to vote gov, because you, by the MO, are constantly asking the judge, did they beat this? Did they get past this? Did they, in their argument, beat this? Did they prove this implication in the impact? And every additional question you can make the judge pose to the gov is an additional layer of skepticism to the gov offense, which ends with PMRs that are too flippant on these questions, forcing the judge then to vote up. Those are my broad thoughts on the MO, on the strategy of the MO, on how you can push the MO forward. Hopefully it was helpful. If you have any additional questions, reach out to me, and good luck at your tournament.